FBI Supervisory Special Agent Darnell Washington stood in the airport security office, staring down at three trembling officers. His voice cut through the silence like ice. "You just detained the wrong man." 2 weeks earlier, he was just an ordinary black traveler walking through the terminal. Nobody could have predicted that their terrible decision would destroy everything they had built. Before we dive into this incredible story, I want to know where you are watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below. If you are ready for a story that will leave you speechless, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Trust me, you do not want to miss a single moment of what happens next. This is a story about injustice, redemption, and the moment when karma came knocking at the door. Darnell Washington was 47 years old and had dedicated 23 years of his life to serving his country through the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was not just any agent. He was the Supervisory Special Agent in charge of the Counterterrorism Division for the entire Northeast region of the United States. Throughout his distinguished career, he had successfully dismantled 47 major criminal operations and had received commendations from 3 different presidents. His name was spoken with reverence in law enforcement circles across the nation, and his expertise was sought after by agencies around the world. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches tall with a muscular build that spoke of discipline and strength, Darnell commanded respect wherever he went. But on this particular Friday afternoon in November, none of that mattered. He was dressed casually in a gray hoodie, faded blue jeans, and a simple baseball cap. He carried no badge, no weapon, and no visible signs of his prestigious position. He was on vacation, heading home after a 3-week classified assignment in Seattle, and all he could think about was his daughter Jasmine's 16th birthday party that was just 3 days away. His wife Lorraine worked as the head nurse of the cardiology department at one of the most respected hospitals in Virginia. She was waiting at home with their daughter, preparing for the surprise celebration that Darnell had been planning for months. In his carry-on bag, wrapped in beautiful paper with a silver bow, was a gold necklace with a heart-shaped pendant that had cost him 3 months of savings. Every time he thought about seeing Jasmine's face when she opened it, his heart swelled with anticipation. He had missed so many moments over the years. Birthdays, anniversaries, school plays, and countless dinners. This time, he was determined to be there, and nothing was going to stop him. Bradley Morrison was 34 years old and held the position of lead security officer at Charlotte Douglas International Airport in North Carolina. He had sandy blonde hair cut in a severe military style and cold blue eyes that seemed to constantly scan his surroundings with suspicion. Bradley had grown up in a small town in rural Georgia, raised by a father who had spent 30 years as a local police officer and who had filled his son's head with poisonous ideas about certain types of people. Bradley believed with absolute certainty that he possessed a special instinct for identifying criminals. He trusted his gut above all else, and his gut told him that black men who dressed casually and sat alone were almost always up to something. The statistics from his department told a different story. Under his watch, black travelers were stopped and questioned at a rate 5 times higher than white travelers. There had been complaints, dozens of them over the years, but they had all disappeared into the administrative void, buried by someone with the power to make problems go away. That someone was Howard Morrison, Bradley's uncle and the director of security for the entire airport. Howard was 58 years old with graying hair and the soft body of a man who spent more time behind a desk than on his feet. He had hired his nephew despite knowing about Bradley's troubled past. Years earlier, Bradley had been quietly dismissed from the local police force after multiple allegations of racial profiling and excessive force. The official records had been sealed, the complaints had been settled out of court, and Bradley had been given a fresh start at the airport thanks to his uncle's intervention. Howard saw nothing wrong with the way Bradley operated. In fact, he encouraged it. He believed that certain people needed to be watched more closely than others, and he had built an entire department culture around that belief. Keith Patterson was 29 years old and served as Bradley's most loyal subordinate. He was a large man with thick arms and a perpetual scowl who enjoyed the physical aspects of the job a little too much. He followed Bradley's orders without question and had been involved in several incidents that had resulted in complaints from travelers. None of those complaints had ever resulted in any consequences. Tammy Sullivan was 31 years old and represented a different kind of problem. She was not actively malicious like Bradley or Keith, but she was complicit in her silence. She had witnessed countless instances of discrimination and mistreatment, and she had never once spoken up. She told herself that she needed the job, that she could not afford to make waves, that it was not her place to interfere. Every time she watched Bradley target another black traveler, a small piece of her soul withered away, but she kept her mouth shut and looked the other way. On this Friday afternoon, November 15th, Charlotte Douglas International Airport was buzzing with activity. It was one of the busiest airports in the United States, serving as a major hub for travelers heading to destinations across the country and around the world. The terminal was crowded with business travelers rushing to catch flights, families heading off on vacations, and weary passengers waiting for delayed connections. The afternoon sun streamed through the massive windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Security personnel in their crisp uniforms moved through the crowds, their eyes constantly scanning for anything out of the ordinary. Darnell arrived at the airport at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon. He moved through the main security checkpoint without incident, his bag passing through the scanner and his body clearing the metal detector without triggering any alerts. He collected his belongings and made his way to Gate B-17, where his flight to Virginia was scheduled to depart in approximately 2 hours. He found a seat in the waiting area, settled into the uncomfortable plastic chair, and pulled out his phone to call Lorraine. The conversation was warm and filled with love. They talked about the party preparations, about the decorations Lorraine had chosen, about the guest list and the cake and all the small details that would make Jasmine's birthday special. Darnell laughed as he described the necklace he had bought, careful not to reveal too much in case Jasmine might somehow overhear. He told Lorraine he loved her and that he could not wait to see her face when he walked through the door. While Darnell was lost in this moment of domestic bliss, Bradley Morrison was walking through the terminal on his routine patrol. His eyes moved methodically across the crowd, categorizing and assessing each person he saw. When his gaze landed on Darnell, something clicked in his brain. He saw a black man in a hoodie, sitting alone, talking on the phone with an animated expression. To anyone else, this would have been an unremarkable sight. To Bradley, it was a red flag waving in his face. He stopped walking and watched Darnell for several long moments, his instincts screaming that something was wrong with this picture. He signaled to Keith and Tammy, who were patrolling nearby, and gestured toward Darnell with a subtle nod of his head. Keith moved closer, his hand instinctively drifting toward the handcuffs on his belt. Tammy hesitated for just a moment before following, a knot forming in her stomach that she chose to ignore. Bradley's voice was low and confident as he spoke to his colleagues. "That one right there. Something is off about him. I can feel it in my bones." Keith nodded in immediate agreement, his eyes narrowing as he studied Darnell. Tammy said nothing, but she did not object either, and her silence was all the permission Bradley needed. Bradley led his small team across the terminal floor, weaving through the crowds of travelers with practiced ease. His steps were deliberate and unhurried, the walk of a man who believed he had every right to do what he was about to do. Keith flanked him on the right side, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the throng of passengers. Tammy followed a few steps behind, her eyes darting nervously between her colleagues and the man they were approaching. Darnell was still on the phone with Lorraine, completely unaware that he had become the target of attention. He was laughing at something his wife had said, his head tilted back slightly, his guard completely down. When Bradley stepped directly into his line of sight and stood there with his arms crossed, Darnell's laughter faded into confusion. He held up one finger to indicate he needed a moment and spoke quickly into the phone. "Honey, I need to call you back. Something's happening here." He ended the call before Lorraine could respond and looked up at the 3 security officers standing in front of him. Bradley's voice carried the weight of authority and something else, something that sounded almost like satisfaction. "Sir, we need to see your identification right now." The demand came without preamble, without courtesy, without even the pretense of an explanation. Darnell blinked in surprise but kept his composure. He had been in enough difficult situations throughout his career to know that staying calm was essential. He asked in a polite and measured tone, "Is there some kind of problem, officer? Has something happened?" Bradley did not answer the question. Instead, he repeated his demand with increased intensity, his voice rising just enough to attract the attention of nearby passengers. "I said I need to see your identification. Now." Keith shifted his weight and placed his hand conspicuously on the handcuffs hanging from his belt. The message was clear. Darnell reached slowly into his pocket, making sure to telegraph every movement so there could be no misunderstanding. He produced his driver's license and his boarding pass and handed them over without protest. Bradley snatched the documents from Darnell's hand and examined them with exaggerated scrutiny. He compared the photo on the license to Darnell's face multiple times, tilting the card back and forth as if searching for some sign of forgery. The license clearly showed Darnell's name, his address in Virginia, and a photo that was obviously him. The boarding pass confirmed his seat on the flight to Virginia scheduled to depart from Gate B-17. Everything was in order. Everything was legitimate. But Bradley was not satisfied. He fired off a rapid series of questions, each one more invasive than the last. Where was Darnell coming from? What was his business in Charlotte? Why was he traveling alone? What was the purpose of his trip? Darnell answered each question patiently and honestly. He explained that he was returning home from a business trip to Seattle and that he was eager to get back to his family. Bradley pressed harder, demanding to know the nature of Darnell's work. This was where things became complicated. Darnell could not simply announce that he was an FBI agent without potentially compromising his identity and the classified work he had been doing. He chose his words carefully and said, "I work for the federal government." The vagueness of this answer had the opposite effect of what Darnell intended. Instead of satisfying Bradley, it seemed to confirm his suspicions. His eyes narrowed and a thin smile played at the corners of his mouth, the smile of a predator who had cornered his prey. Passengers in the surrounding area had begun to notice the confrontation. Heads turned and conversations died as people strained to see what was happening. A few people pulled out their phones and began recording. Among the onlookers was an elderly white woman who shook her head slowly while staring at Darnell with disapproval, as if his mere presence in handcuffs would have been entirely justified. Not far from her stood a young black man in his 20s who watched the scene with an expression of weary recognition. He had seen this play out before, perhaps had experienced it himself, and his eyes met Darnell's for just a moment in a silent exchange of understanding. But he did not intervene. He did not speak up. Like so many others before him, he was too afraid of what might happen if he inserted himself into the situation. Bradley made his decision and announced it with the casual authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. "You need to come with us for additional screening. This is just a routine security check. Nothing to worry about if you have nothing to hide." Darnell recognized the manipulation in those words immediately. The implication that refusing would be an admission of guilt. The false reassurance designed to make compliance seem like the only reasonable option. He asked calmly what the basis for the additional screening was. Bradley's response was dismissive and vague. "We have concerns that need to be addressed. You can either cooperate voluntarily or we can make this official." The threat hung in the air between them. Darnell knew his rights. He knew that he could refuse and demand a supervisor. But he also knew how these situations could escalate, how a black man asserting his rights could quickly find himself face down on the ground with a knee on his neck. He had dedicated his career to protecting people, and here he was being treated like a criminal in his own country simply because of the color of his skin. He stood up slowly, keeping his hands visible at all times, and prepared to follow the officers. As they began walking, Darnell noticed something that made his jaw tighten with suppressed anger. They passed directly by two white men who were dressed almost identically to him. Same style hoodie. Same casual jeans. Same baseball caps. Neither of them received so much as a second glance from Bradley or his team. The discrimination was so blatant, so obvious, that it would have been almost laughable if it were not so infuriating. Keith walked close behind Darnell, close enough that when he pushed his hand against Darnell's back to urge him forward, it felt more like a shove than a guide. Darnell stopped walking and turned his head slightly. His voice was calm but firm. "There is no need to put your hands on me. I am cooperating fully." Keith's response dripped with hostility. "Are you resisting? Because that is what it sounds like to me." Bradley quickly interjected before the situation could escalate further. "Just keep moving. We can sort this out in the interview room." They led Darnell through a maze of corridors that took them away from the public areas of the terminal and into the restricted zones where travelers rarely ventured. The walls changed from cheerful advertisements and flight information displays to plain white cinderblock and harsh fluorescent lighting. Finally, they stopped in front of a door marked Security Interview Room 2, and Bradley opened it with a key card. The room beyond was small and claustrophobic, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, with no windows and only a single ventilation grate in the ceiling. A metal table was bolted to the floor in the center of the room, with 2 metal chairs on opposite sides. A security camera in the corner blinked its red recording light. Bradley gestured toward one of the chairs and said, "Sit." Darnell complied, settling into the cold metal seat and placing his hands flat on the table in front of him. Keith took up position in the corner of the room, his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on Darnell with undisguised hostility. Tammy remained outside the door, watching through the small reinforced window, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. Out in the terminal, the videos recorded by passengers were already being uploaded to social media. Within minutes, they would begin their viral spread across the internet, and the clock would start ticking on Bradley Morrison's career. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud that seemed to seal Darnell in this small room with his captors. Bradley took the seat across from him and leaned back with an air of smug satisfaction, while Keith remained standing in the corner like a guard dog waiting for the command to attack. The interrogation began immediately, with Bradley asking the same questions he had asked in the terminal, as if repetition might somehow produce different answers. Darnell responded to each query with the same patient, measured responses he had given before. Where was he from? Virginia. Where was he coming from? Seattle. Why was he traveling? Returning home from work. What kind of work? Federal government. The circular nature of the questioning was clearly designed to frustrate him, to make him slip up or lose his temper, but Darnell had spent decades conducting interrogations himself and he recognized every tactic Bradley was employing. Bradley demanded to see the contents of Darnell's carry-on bag, and Darnell agreed without hesitation. He had nothing to hide and everything to gain by demonstrating his cooperation. Keith retrieved the bag from where it had been deposited by the door and unzipped it on the table with rough, careless movements. Inside were the unremarkable possessions of a man returning from a business trip. Neatly folded clothes. A toiletry kit. A phone charger. A paperback novel that Darnell had been reading on the flight. And there, nestled carefully among the clothing, was a small box wrapped in shimmering silver paper with an elegant bow on top. Bradley's eyes locked onto the package immediately. He picked it up and shook it gently, listening to the soft rattle of whatever was inside. What is this? Darnell felt a pang of protective instinct. That gift represented weeks of careful shopping, hours of deliberation, and all of his hopes for making his daughter's birthday special. It is a birthday present for my daughter. A necklace. Please, I would prefer if you did not open it. I want her to be the first one to see it. Bradley ignored the request completely and tore away the wrapping paper with deliberate slowness, letting the pieces fall to the floor like confetti. Inside was a velvet jewelry box, and inside that was the gold necklace with its delicate heart-shaped pendant catching the harsh fluorescent light. Bradley held up the necklace and studied it with naked suspicion. The gold gleamed expensively, and the craftsmanship was obviously high quality. Where did you get the money for something like this? The question landed like a slap across Darnell's face. The implication was clear and ugly. How could a black man afford something so nice? He must have stolen it or acquired it through some illegal means. Darnell felt the anger building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. I earned it. Through my work. The same way anyone earns money to buy gifts for their children. Keith let out a derisive snort from his corner. Must be some kind of work you do. The insinuation hung in the air, poisonous and offensive. Darnell chose not to respond. He had learned long ago that engaging with ignorance only gave it power. The interrogation continued to escalate. Bradley demanded contact information for Darnell's employer so he could verify the story about federal employment. Darnell explained once again that his work was classified and that he could not simply provide details to satisfy the curiosity of airport security. However, he offered a compromise. I can give you a phone number to call. It will connect you with someone who can verify my identity and my employment without compromising any sensitive information. Bradley's response was dripping with sarcasm. Oh, I am sure you have a number ready. Probably some friend waiting by the phone to lie for you and back up whatever story you are trying to sell. Darnell's patience was remarkable, but even he had limits. That is an inappropriate assumption to make. I am offering you a legitimate way to resolve this situation peacefully. Bradley stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. He leaned across the table until his face was just inches from Darnell's. I make the assumptions around here. I decide what is appropriate. And right now, what I have decided is that you are going to sit in that chair until you start telling me the truth. The request for a physical search came next, delivered as a command rather than a request. Darnell stood as instructed, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. Keith approached with barely concealed eagerness and conducted the search with unnecessary roughness. His hands pressed hard against Darnell's shoulders, ran roughly down his sides, and patted his legs with enough force to leave bruises. When his fingers dug into the sensitive area around Darnell's kidneys, a flash of genuine pain crossed Darnell's face. I want it noted for the record that I am objecting to this search and the manner in which it is being conducted. His voice was calm but firm. Keith responded with another rough shove. Noted and ignored. The sound of Darnell's phone ringing cut through the tension in the room. The screen lit up with a photo of a beautiful black woman and the name, Lorraine, surrounded by small heart emojis. Bradley moved faster than Darnell could react and snatched the phone from the table before Darnell could reach it. Who is Lorraine? The question was asked with suspicion, as if even having a wife was somehow evidence of wrongdoing. She is my wife. Please, let me answer. She will be worried if I do not respond. I told her I would call her back. Bradley looked at the phone as it continued to ring, then looked back at Darnell with cold indifference. She can wait. He pressed the button to decline the call and slipped the phone into his own pocket. The action was a violation so personal, so petty, that Darnell felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. That phone was his connection to his family, his lifeline to the people he loved, and this man had taken it from him like it meant nothing. But he said nothing. He knew that any reaction could be used against him, twisted into evidence of aggression or noncompliance. Bradley then revealed what he claimed was the justification for all of this. He announced with great seriousness that Darnell matched the description of a suspect in a recent theft in the area. Darnell asked to see the specific description. What were the physical characteristics? What was the suspect alleged to have stolen? What evidence linked Darnell to this supposed crime? Bradley refused to provide any details, claiming the information was classified. The irony was not lost on Darnell that Bradley was using the same justification that Darnell himself had used moments earlier, but using it as a shield for lies rather than legitimate security concerns. Keith added his own contribution to the accusations. You were acting suspicious out there. Looking around constantly. Making phone calls. That is classic scouting behavior. You were probably casing the terminal, figuring out where the security gaps are. Darnell's response was simple and direct. I was calling my wife. We were discussing our daughter's birthday party. There is nothing suspicious about a man talking to his family. Bradley's smile was thin and humorless. That is a very convenient story. Too convenient, if you ask me. The interview room had become suffocating. The walls seemed to press inward with each passing minute. Darnell had lost track of how long he had been in this room, answering the same questions, enduring the same accusations, maintaining his dignity in the face of deliberate humiliation. Bradley reached into his pocket and produced a pair of metal handcuffs, dropping them onto the table with a clatter that echoed off the bare walls. The threat was unmistakable. "This is your last chance to tell us the truth. Either you start cooperating, or things are going to get a lot worse for you." Darnell looked at the handcuffs, then looked at Bradley, and his voice did not waver. "I have told you nothing but the truth since the moment you approached me. If you choose not to believe me, that is your decision. But I have done nothing wrong, and I will not confess to crimes I did not commit." Bradley's patience, such as it was, had reached its end. He nodded once to Keith, a silent command that both men understood perfectly. Keith moved forward with the handcuffs, grabbing Darnell's wrists and wrenching them behind his back with far more force than necessary. The metal cuffs clicked shut with a sound that seemed to echo in the small room, and Darnell immediately felt them biting into his skin. They were too tight, deliberately so, and he could feel the circulation being cut off to his hands. "The cuffs are too tight. You need to loosen them." His voice remained calm even as the pain began to build. Keith leaned close to his ear and whispered with evident satisfaction, "You should have thought about that before you started lying to us." Tammy, still watching through the window in the door, pressed her hand against the glass. Her face was pale and her eyes were wide with distress, but she made no move to enter the room, no attempt to stop what was happening. Her silence was its own kind of violence. In a quiet suburban home in Virginia, Lorraine Washington was pacing the kitchen floor with her phone clutched in her hand. She had called her husband 3 times now, and each call had gone unanswered. This was unlike Darnell. He always answered her calls, or at least sent a text to let her know he was busy. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones with the certainty that comes from 2 decades of marriage. When her phone finally rang with an incoming call from Darnell's number, she answered before the first ring had finished. But the voice on the other end was not her husband. It was cold and official and completely unfamiliar. "Your husband is being detained for questioning. He will call you when we are done with him." The line went dead before she could ask a single question. Lorraine stood frozen in her kitchen, her mind racing through every terrible possibility. Detained? For what? By whom? Her husband was one of the most decorated FBI agents in the country. What could possibly be happening? She did not waste time on panic. Instead, she went to her contact list and began making calls to every colleague of Darnell's whose number she had. Back at the airport, the situation was evolving in ways that Bradley could not have anticipated. The videos recorded by passengers in the terminal had been uploaded to social media platforms and were spreading with the viral intensity that only outrage can generate. One video in particular, showing Darnell being led away with his hands visible and his expression calm and dignified, had already accumulated tens of thousands of views. The comments section was exploding with fury. People were sharing their own stories of being profiled at airports. Activists were tagging news organizations and demanding coverage. The hashtag airport racism began trending in the region and would soon go national. A local news producer received a tip from a friend who had seen the video and immediately dispatched a camera crew to the airport. Inside the interview room, time had become meaningless. Darnell had been handcuffed and confined for over 2 hours. The metal restraints had rubbed his wrists raw, and he could see angry red marks forming where the skin had broken. He had not been offered water. He had not been allowed to use the restroom. He had not been permitted to make a phone call or contact an attorney. Every request had been denied with the same dismissive response. "You are not under arrest, you are just being detained, so you do not have those rights." Darnell knew this was legally questionable at best, but he also knew that arguing the point would only make things worse. So he sat in silence, conserving his energy, waiting for the moment when he would have the opportunity to set things right. "Now I want to pause here and ask you something important. Do you think Darnell is handling this situation correctly? Do you believe that staying calm and cooperative is the right approach when you are being treated so unjustly? If you think Darnell is doing the right thing by maintaining his composure, comment number 1 below. If you think he should be more assertive in demanding his rights, comment number 2. I really want to hear your thoughts on this, so make sure to leave your opinion in the comments. And while you are down there, hit that like button if you are invested in finding out what happens next. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already, because trust me, this story is about to take a turn that nobody saw coming. The arrival of Howard Morrison added a new dimension to the nightmare. The director of security had been monitoring the situation from his office and had decided to make a personal appearance. He entered the interview room with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. His eyes swept over Darnell, lingered on the handcuffs, and then turned to his nephew with an expression of approval. "What do we have here, Bradley?" Bradley straightened up, clearly pleased to have his uncle's attention. "Suspicious individual, sir. Vague about his employment. Carrying expensive jewelry he cannot adequately explain. Resistant to questioning." Howard nodded slowly, as if this litany of non-crime somehow justified the hours of detention and the restraints that were now visibly injuring Darnell's wrists. "Good instincts. I always knew you had the eye for this kind of thing. Keep at it. Let me know if you need anything." He gave Bradley a pat on the shoulder and left the room without once acknowledging Darnell as a human being. Darnell watched him go and understood that he was dealing with something larger than one overzealous security officer. This was a systemic problem, a culture of discrimination that started at the top and filtered down to every level of the organization. Getting out of this room was going to be more complicated than he had initially thought. The physical toll was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Darnell's shoulders ached from having his arms restrained behind his back for so long. His wrists throbbed with every heartbeat, and he could feel the swelling pressing against the unyielding metal of the cuffs. His throat was dry and his head had begun to pound from dehydration and stress. But worse than any physical discomfort was the emotional weight of the situation. He thought about Jasmine waiting at home, probably helping her mother set up decorations for a party that might not happen. He thought about the necklace, now unwrapped and lying discarded on the table, its surprise ruined forever. He thought about all the other black men and women who had sat in rooms like this one, facing accusations they did not deserve, enduring treatment that violated every principle of justice and human dignity. Most of them did not have FBI credentials hidden in their background. Most of them had no one coming to rescue them. What happened to them? Will anyone come to help Darnell before it is too late? What will happen when the truth about his identity finally comes out? The door to the interview room suddenly swung open with such force that it banged against the wall. A man in a black suit stormed in, his face flushed red with barely contained rage. "What the hell is going on here?" Bradley jumped to his feet, startled by the sudden intrusion. "Who are you? This is a secure area." The man in the suit reached into his jacket and produced a badge that gleamed gold under the fluorescent lights. "FBI. And you are about to have a very bad day." Raymond Foster was 52 years old with silver hair and the lean build of a man who had spent decades chasing criminals through the streets of American cities. He had joined the FBI the same year as Darnell, and the two men had risen through the ranks together, covering each other's backs through countless dangerous situations and becoming closer than brothers in the process. When Lorraine's panicked call had reached him at the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., Raymond had not hesitated for a single second. He had commandeered a bureau vehicle and driven to Charlotte at speeds that would have earned any civilian a lengthy jail sentence. For hours after Darnell's detention began, Raymond Foster walked through the doors of Charlotte Douglas International Airport with the fury of a man on a mission. The confrontation in the interview room was immediate and intense. Raymond took in the scene with the practiced eye of a veteran investigator. He saw his friend and colleague sitting handcuffed in a metal chair, wrists visibly swollen and raw. He saw Bradley standing with a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. He saw Keith trying to make himself smaller in the corner. And he saw Tammy peering through the window with an expression of desperate hope that someone was finally going to do something. Raymond's voice cut through the room like a blade. Remove those cuffs from him right now. Bradley attempted to assert his authority. Sir, this man is a suspect in an ongoing investigation. We have reason to believe he may be involved in criminal activity. Raymond stepped closer to Bradley, close enough that the security officer had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. What investigation? What criminal activity? What evidence do you have? What probable cause justified this detention? The questions came rapid fire, each one a bullet that Bradley could not dodge. Bradley looked to Keith for support, but Keith had developed a sudden fascination with the floor tiles. He looked to the door, perhaps hoping his uncle would reappear to rescue him, but Howard was nowhere to be seen. He tried to salvage the situation with bluster. He matched the description of a suspect. He was acting suspiciously. He was evasive about his employment. Raymond's laugh was sharp and humorless. Show me the suspect description. Show me the report that was filed. Show me the documented observations of suspicious behavior. Show me anything, anything at all, that justifies keeping a man handcuffed in a room for 4 hours without charges, without access to legal counsel, without basic human necessities. The silence that followed was deafening. Bradley had nothing to show because there was nothing. No report. No description. No probable cause. Just prejudice dressed up in the language of security. Raymond turned to Darnell, and his voice softened with genuine concern. Darnell, are you okay? Darnell managed a weak smile despite everything he had endured. I have definitely been better, Ray. But I will survive. Bradley's eyes went wide with shock. Wait. You know this man? Raymond spun back to face Bradley, and his voice dripped with contempt. Know him? This is Supervisory Special Agent Darnell Washington. He is the head of the Counterterrorism Division for the entire Northeast region of the FBI. He has received commendations from 3 presidents of the United States. He has more security clearance than everyone in this building combined. He has dedicated his entire life to protecting this country, and you have been treating him like a common criminal because he had the audacity to be black in your airport. The color drained from Bradley's face so completely that he looked like he might faint. Keith made a small choking sound in the back of his throat. Through the window, Tammy's hand flew up to cover her mouth. The magnitude of their mistake was beginning to dawn on them, but they had not yet grasped the full extent of the consequences they were about to face. Bradley tried desperately to backpedal. We had no way of knowing. He was not carrying any identification that showed his position. He was dressed casually. He was vague about his employment. Raymond's response was merciless. He gave you his driver's license. He offered you a verification number to call. He cooperated fully with every demand you made. And you chose to ignore all of that because your prejudice was more important to you than the facts. The commotion had attracted attention throughout the security wing. Howard Morrison came hurrying down the corridor, alerted by one of his staff that something significant was happening. He burst into the interview room with all the authority of his position and demanded to know what was going on. Raymond turned his attention to the new arrival and recognized immediately that this was someone higher up the chain of command. You must be the supervisor who authorized this detention to continue for 4 hours. Howard drew himself up to his full height and attempted to project an image of competence. I authorized a routine security check. Standard procedure. Raymond's response was measured but devastating. A routine check that lasted 4 hours. A routine check that involved handcuffing a man without charges. A routine check that denied him water, denied him restroom access, denied him the right to contact his family or an attorney. Is that the routine at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, Mr. Morrison? Howard began to sweat visibly, dark patches forming under the arms of his uniform shirt. We were being thorough. In today's climate, you cannot be too careful. Raymond took a step closer to Howard, and his voice dropped to a near whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. You were not being thorough. You were being racist. And that word is going to follow you for the rest of your career. Darnell had listened to the exchange in silence, but now he rose from his chair and spoke quietly to Raymond. "Ray, let me handle this." Raymond nodded and stepped back, giving Darnell the floor. Darnell approached Bradley and stood directly in front of him. His wrists were still raw and swollen, his body ached from hours of mistreatment, but his eyes held no anger. Only a profound sadness. "I have spent 23 years protecting this country. I have missed birthdays and anniversaries and funerals. I have put my life on the line more times than I can count. I have sacrificed things that I can never get back. And today, in my own country, in an airport that my tax dollars helped to fund, I was treated like a criminal solely because of the color of my skin." Bradley could not meet Darnell's eyes. His head hung low and his shoulders slumped with the weight of what he had done. "You did not see an FBI agent when you looked at me. You did not see a father who was rushing home to celebrate his daughter's birthday. You did not see a human being with hopes and dreams and a family who loves him. All you saw was a black man in a hoodie, and that was enough for you to decide that I must be guilty of something." The door to the interview room opened once more, and a group of people entered. There were lawyers in expensive suits, representatives from various agencies, and media consultants already preparing damage control strategies. And among them was a woman with tears streaming down her face, a beautiful black woman who pushed past everyone else and ran directly into Darnell's arms. Lorraine held her husband so tightly that it seemed she would never let go, her body shaking with sobs of relief and residual fear. "I was so scared. I did not know what was happening. I thought I might never see you again." Darnell wrapped his arms around his wife and let himself feel, for the first time in 4 hours, something other than carefully controlled composure. His voice was thick with emotion when he spoke. "I am here now. I am okay. We are going to be okay." And for that moment, surrounded by lawyers and officials and the men who had tormented him, Darnell Washington allowed himself to simply be a husband holding his wife. Raymond insisted that the handcuffs be removed immediately, and Keith complied with trembling hands. The metal restraints had left deep impressions in Darnell's skin, and angry purple bruises were already forming around his wrists. Lorraine saw the injuries and let out a sob of anguish, her fingers hovering over the damaged flesh as if afraid to touch and cause more pain. Darnell took her hands in his and raised them to his lips. "It looks worse than it feels. I promise you, I am going to be fine." But his eyes told a different story, one of exhaustion and trauma and a deep, abiding sadness that would take time to heal. The legal team that had accompanied Lorraine wasted no time in establishing the gravity of the situation. Victoria Chen was a formidable attorney who specialized in civil rights cases and had a reputation for holding institutions accountable for discrimination. She had been gathering evidence throughout the journey to Charlotte, and what she had collected was damning. The videos from the terminal had gone viral, accumulating millions of views across multiple platforms. Major news networks had picked up the story and were already running segments with titles like "FBI Agent Detained for Flying While Black" and "Airport Security Scandal Exposes Systematic Racism." Civil rights organizations from across the country had issued statements of condemnation. Politicians were calling for investigations. The court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict, and the formal legal proceedings had not even begun. Victoria addressed Darnell with professional directness tempered by genuine sympathy. "Agent Washington, we have more than enough evidence to pursue multiple avenues of legal action. Civil rights violations, false imprisonment, assault, emotional distress. The question is how far you want to take this. What outcome do you want to see?" Darnell considered the question carefully while looking at Bradley, Keith, and Howard huddled in the corner of the room like frightened children waiting for punishment. These 3 men had caused him tremendous harm. They had humiliated him, injured him, and reminded him of every time in his life when the color of his skin had made him a target. A part of him wanted to see them destroyed, wanted to watch their careers crumble and their reputations disintegrate. But a larger part of him knew that personal revenge would accomplish nothing lasting. Marcus Thompson, the executive director of Charlotte Douglas International Airport, arrived in a state of barely controlled panic. He was a white man in his late 50s with an expensive suit and the harried expression of someone watching their professional legacy collapse in real time. He had seen the videos. He had read the reports. He understood that this was the worst public relations disaster in the airport's history, and he was desperate to contain the damage. His apology to Darnell was effusive but hollow, the words of a man more concerned with optics than justice. Agent Washington, on behalf of Charlotte Douglas International Airport, I want to express our deepest and most sincere apologies for the treatment you received today. This is not who we are. This is not what we stand for. We are committed to conducting a full investigation and taking appropriate disciplinary action. Darnell listened to the apology without responding. He had heard enough empty words and corporate platitudes to last a lifetime. He was more interested in what would actually be done. Bradley, despite everything that had happened, had still not fully grasped his responsibility for the situation. His attempt at self-justification was almost pathetic in its blindness. I was just doing my job. I followed my instincts. I saw someone who seemed suspicious and I acted on that perception. That is what we are trained to do. Raymond's response was swift and devastating. Your instincts told you that a black man in casual clothes must be a criminal. Your instincts told you to ignore cooperating behavior and documented identification. Those are not instincts. That is prejudice. And prejudice is not part of any legitimate security training. Victoria added her own observation, pulling up data on her tablet. We have obtained footage from the terminal cameras. In the 10 minutes before you approached Agent Washington, you walked past at least 6 white individuals who were dressed in nearly identical clothing. Not one of them was stopped. Not one of them was questioned. Can you explain that discrepancy, Mr. Morrison? Bradley had no explanation. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Keith attempted to distance himself from the situation with the oldest excuse in the book. I was just following orders. Bradley told me what to do and I did it. Raymond's voice was cold with contempt. Following orders is not a defense. It was not a defense at Nuremberg, it was not a defense at My Lai, and it is not a defense here. You made choices today. You chose to put those handcuffs on too tight. You chose to shove a man who was cooperating. You chose to participate in his mistreatment. Those were your choices, and you will be held accountable for them. The investigation into Howard Morrison's tenure as Director of Security had already begun, and the preliminary findings were shocking. Victoria revealed that over the past 5 years, the security department under Howard's leadership had stopped and questioned black travelers at a rate 7 times higher than white travelers. There had been 47 formal complaints alleging racial discrimination, and every single one had been dismissed through internal review processes controlled by Howard himself. Bradley Morrison was the subject of more complaints than any other officer, but instead of facing consequences, he had been promoted and protected. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not a case of one bad actor making poor decisions. This was institutional racism, documented and systematic and deliberately concealed from outside oversight. Howard attempted to defend himself with statistics and context, but his words rang hollow against the weight of evidence. Marcus Thompson listened to the revelations about his own airport with growing horror. He had inherited Howard when he took the director position 3 years ago and had never questioned the security department's operations. Now he was realizing that his lack of oversight had allowed a discriminatory system to flourish under his watch. His face had gone pale, and his hands shook as he processed the implications for his own career. Darnell asked Lorraine to step outside with him for a private conversation. They found a quiet corner of the corridor away from the chaos and the cameras and the officials scrambling to manage the crisis. Lorraine took his hands in hers, careful to avoid the bruised wrists, and looked into his eyes with the same love and trust that had sustained their marriage for 20 years. Whatever you decide, I support you completely. This is your choice to make. Darnell thought about the easy path. Accept an apology, take a settlement, and move on with his life. He had the power to make this all go away with a phone call. But what about the next person? What about the black father or mother or child who would walk through this airport tomorrow and be treated the same way he had been? They would not have an FBI badge to protect them. They would not have powerful friends to come to their rescue. They would be alone, just like so many others had been alone before them. He looked at his wife, at the woman who had stood by him through every sacrifice and every danger of his career, and made his decision. This is not just about me. It cannot be just about me. I have to fight, not for revenge, but for everyone who has been through this and did not have the ability to fight back. Lorraine nodded, her eyes bright with pride and unshed tears. Then fight. I will be right beside you. They returned to the interview room together, hand in hand. Darnell faced the assembled group and spoke with quiet authority. I am not going to let this go. Not because I want revenge. Not because I want to see anyone suffer. But because somewhere in this airport right now, there might be another black traveler being treated exactly the way I was treated. They might not have the credentials or the connections that I have. They might leave here feeling humiliated and helpless and convinced that the system will never protect them. I cannot let that continue. This ends today. 2 weeks had passed since the incident at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, and the ripples had grown into waves that were reshaping the landscape of airport security across the nation. A full federal investigation had been launched, involving the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Darnell had returned to his position at the Bureau, but he dedicated every spare moment to following the progress of the case. His story had become a symbol, a rallying point for everyone who had ever been profiled or mistreated because of their race. The hashtags Justice for Darnell and End Airport Racism continued to trend on social media, and his face appeared on news broadcasts almost daily. The investigators had uncovered a web of discrimination that extended far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. Howard Morrison had been building his discriminatory system for 12 years, carefully constructing a departmental culture that normalized racial profiling. New employees were subtly encouraged to trust their instincts when deciding who to stop, with clear implicit messaging about which travelers deserved extra scrutiny. Official training programs on identifying genuinely suspicious behavior had been neglected, replaced by an informal education in prejudice passed down from supervisors to subordinates. The data was undeniable. Hundreds of black travelers had been stopped, questioned, and in many cases detained without any legitimate justification. Their complaints had been systematically buried, their voices silenced by an administration that saw them as problems to be managed rather than citizens to be served. As news of the investigation spread, other victims began coming forward. Jerome Patterson was a 61-year-old cardiovascular surgeon who had been detained at Charlotte Douglas 3 times in the past 2 years. Each time, he had been traveling to medical conferences to share his groundbreaking research on heart disease. Each time, he had been treated like a criminal for the crime of being a successful black man in an expensive suit. The emotional toll had been devastating. He had begun avoiding air travel altogether, driving long distances instead of flying, limiting his professional opportunities because the thought of another airport interrogation filled him with dread. Monique Williams was a 45-year-old professor of African American studies at a prestigious university. She had been detained on her way to deliver a keynote address at an academic conference, and by the time she was released, she had missed her speaking slot entirely. The conference had been unable to reschedule, and a year's worth of research and preparation had been wasted. She had filed a complaint with the airport administration and had received a form letter response dismissing her concerns as unfounded. Deshaun Carter was just 19 years old, a talented basketball player at a Division I university with dreams of making it to the professional leagues. He had been traveling with his team to an away game when security officers pulled him out of the line, demanded to search his belongings, and questioned him for 45 minutes in front of his teammates and coaches. The humiliation had been unbearable. His white teammates had watched in shock, unable or unwilling to intervene. Deshaun had never fully recovered. His performance on the court had suffered, his grades had dropped, and he had started seeing a therapist for anxiety and depression. Patricia Washington, no relation to Darnell, was a 72-year-old veteran who had served her country with distinction in the Army Nurse Corps. She used a wheelchair due to injuries sustained during her service, and that wheelchair had apparently been reason enough for suspicion. Security officers had forced her to stand, causing her significant pain, while they searched her chair for hidden contraband. They had found nothing, of course, and had released her with a dismissive apology that made clear they felt no genuine remorse for what they had put her through. Each story was heartbreaking in its own way, but together they painted a picture of systematic abuse that demanded accountability. The public response grew louder with each revelation. Peaceful protests gathered outside the airport, with demonstrators holding signs demanding reform and chanting slogans that echoed through the terminal. Politicians at every level of government issued statements condemning the discrimination and calling for comprehensive changes. Airlines announced they were reviewing their partnerships with security contractors. The pressure for change was becoming impossible to ignore. Bradley Morrison had been suspended without pay pending the outcome of the investigation. He was facing federal charges for civil rights violations, and his attorney was already discussing plea deals to minimize his prison time. His world had collapsed completely. His wife had left him, taking their 2 children and returning to her parents' home. His friends had distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone whose face was synonymous with racism. He spent his days alone in his apartment, watching the news coverage and trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. Keith Patterson had also been suspended and was cooperating fully with investigators in hopes of receiving leniency. He provided detailed testimony about the practices he had witnessed and participated in, implicating not only Bradley and Howard but also several other officers who had engaged in similar behavior. His cooperation was motivated by self-interest rather than genuine remorse, but it was producing valuable evidence nonetheless. Tammy Sullivan had made a different choice. She had voluntarily come forward to offer testimony against her former colleagues, accepting full responsibility for her own complicity in their actions. Her statement to investigators was devastating in its honesty. "I watched it happen over and over again. I saw Bradley target black travelers specifically. I saw Keith use more force than necessary. I saw Howard dismiss every complaint without investigation. And I did nothing. I told myself I needed the job, that I could not afford to make waves, that it was not my place to speak up. But those were just excuses. I was a coward, and my cowardice made me just as guilty as the people who actually did these things." Tammy had become an advocate for reform, speaking publicly about the need for bystanders to find their courage and stand against injustice. Howard Morrison had been terminated immediately following the initial revelations. The criminal investigation had revealed that he had actively obstructed justice by burying complaints and protecting officers who should have been disciplined. He was facing multiple felony charges and was likely to spend years in federal prison. His wife of 30 years had filed for divorce after learning the full extent of his activities. His children refused to take his calls. He had gone from being a respected figure in airport administration to a pariah whose name was synonymous with institutional racism. In the midst of all this turmoil, Darnell received a phone call that reminded him why he was fighting. Jasmine's voice came through the phone, young and earnest and filled with emotion. "Dad, I just wanted to tell you that I am so proud of you. What you are doing, speaking out and pushing for change, it matters. It really matters." Darnell felt his eyes grow moist as he listened to his daughter. "Baby girl, I am just trying to make the world a little better. That is all any of us can do." Jasmine's response stayed with him long after the call ended. "It will be better, Dad. Because of you." The location for the final meeting held a painful symbolism. It was the same security office where Darnell had been detained 2 weeks earlier, the same room where he had been handcuffed and interrogated and treated like a criminal. But this time, the dynamic had completely reversed. Darnell stood at the head of the room in a position of authority, wearing his FBI credentials visibly and flanked by lawyers and federal officials. Bradley, Keith, and Howard sat in metal chairs facing him, their positions mirroring where Darnell had been forced to sit during his ordeal. Tammy was also present, seated apart from her former colleagues, having chosen to align herself with the truth rather than the institution that had failed so many people. The room was crowded with observers. Attorneys representing various parties lined the walls. Representatives from the Department of Justice had come to document the proceedings. Recording devices captured every word for the official record. This was not a trial, not yet, but it was a confrontation that would shape everything that came after. Darnell began by walking slowly toward Bradley Morrison. The man who had tormented him could not meet his eyes, keeping his gaze fixed on the floor with the posture of a defeated enemy. Darnell stood directly in front of him and waited in silence until the weight of the moment forced Bradley to look up. 2 weeks ago, you looked at me and saw a threat. You saw a criminal. You saw everything in the world except a human being. I need to understand why. What was it about me that triggered your suspicion? What did I do that justified 4 hours of detention and abuse? Bradley's voice was barely above a whisper when he finally responded. I do not know. I thought. I believed. I was trained to. His voice trailed off as he struggled to articulate something he had never been forced to examine. Darnell pressed on with calm determination. You believed what exactly? That black men are inherently dangerous. That we are suspicious by default. That we have to prove our innocence while everyone else is presumed innocent. Those beliefs did not come from nowhere. Where did they start? The questions forced Bradley to confront memories he had long buried. He spoke haltingly about his childhood, about a father who had worn a badge and carried a gun and taught his son that certain people were the enemy. He remembered dinner table conversations filled with casual racism, jokes and slurs that had been normalized as simply the way things were. He had entered adulthood believing that his prejudices were actually wisdom, that his discrimination was actually discernment. He had convinced himself that he was protecting people when he was actually persecuting them. I thought I was doing the right thing, Bradley said, his voice cracking. I thought I was keeping people safe. Darnell's response was devastating in its simplicity. You were not protecting people. You were protecting a comfortable worldview where people who look like me are always the threat and never the protector. You were preserving your own sense of superiority. And in the process, you were destroying lives. Bradley had no defense. He sat in silence, tears streaming down his face, as the full weight of his actions pressed down upon him. Darnell turned next to Keith Patterson, who had begun crying before Darnell even reached him. You followed orders without thinking. You pushed me. You tightened those handcuffs until my wrists bled. And now you want to say you were just doing what you were told. But let me ask you something. Did you enjoy it? When you were hurting me, when you were watching me suffer, did some part of you take pleasure in that? Keith's sobs made it difficult for him to speak coherently. No, sir. No. I did not. I mean, I did not think about it that way. I was doing what Bradley said and I did not question it and I should have and I am so sorry. His apology was desperate and pathetic and probably sincere, but sincerity did not undo the damage. Darnell said, sorry does not heal these scars on my wrists. Sorry does not give me back the 4 hours I spent in that chair. Sorry does not help the hundreds of other people who went through the same thing without anyone coming to save them. Sorry is just a word. What matters now is what comes next. Howard Morrison presented a different challenge. Where Bradley was broken and Keith was terrified, Howard remained defiant even in defeat. He sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set, still clinging to the belief that he had done nothing wrong. Darnell approached him with a different energy, recognizing that this man was the architect of the system that had caused so much harm. You are the one I hold most responsible for what happened to me and to everyone else who was victimized by this department. You created this system. You hired officers with histories of discrimination. You protected them when complaints were filed. You built a culture where racism was not just tolerated but encouraged. And you did it all while hiding behind policies and procedures and bureaucratic language designed to obscure the truth. Howard's response was predictable. I was trying to keep this airport safe. In a post-9/11 world, security has to be the priority. If some people were inconvenienced along the way, that is the price of safety. Darnell shook his head slowly. You were not keeping anyone safe. The people you targeted were doctors and professors and athletes and veterans. They were parents and grandparents and children. They were American citizens going about their lives. The only thing they had in common was the color of their skin. You were not protecting the airport from terrorists. You were terrorizing your own people. Finally, Darnell turned to Tammy Sullivan. She sat with her hands clasped in her lap, tears running silently down her cheeks, awaiting his judgment. You watched everything that happened. You saw every abuse, every violation, every act of discrimination. And you said nothing. You did nothing. You allowed it to continue because silence was easier than courage. Tammy nodded, accepting the condemnation. I know. I was afraid. Afraid of losing my job, afraid of being targeted myself, afraid of going against people who had more power than me. But those fears do not excuse what I did. What I failed to do. She paused, gathering herself. I want to make it right. I do not know how, but I want to try. I want to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Darnell studied her for a long moment before responding. Making it right starts with telling the truth. All of it. About everything you witnessed. About every person who was mistreated under this system. That is the price of redemption, and you have to decide if you are willing to pay it. The formal demands came next. Darnell had spent the past 2 weeks working with advocacy groups and legal experts to develop a comprehensive reform plan. He was not interested in personal compensation. The money would not heal his wounds or restore his faith in the system. What he wanted was change. Real, lasting, structural change that would protect others from experiencing what he had experienced. The list was specific and ambitious. Mandatory bias training for every security employee, developed in partnership with civil rights organizations and conducted by experts in the field. Body cameras for all officers, with footage subject to independent review. An oversight board with community representation and real authority to investigate complaints and impose consequences. A compensation fund for victims of past discrimination, funded by the airport and administered by an independent panel. And most importantly, the immediate termination and prosecution of everyone who had participated in or enabled the discriminatory practices. Darnell looked at the 3 people who had tormented him and delivered his final statement. I could have destroyed you. I have the power, the connections, the evidence. I could have made sure you never worked again, never recovered from this moment, spent the rest of your lives suffering for what you did. But destruction is not justice. Change is justice. The question each of you needs to answer is whether you are willing to be part of that change, or whether you are going to spend the rest of your lives running from what you have done. 1 year had passed since Darnell Washington was detained at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. In that time, the world had changed in ways both large and small. The reforms he had demanded had been implemented not just in Charlotte but in airports across the country. The Charlotte model had become a blueprint for addressing institutional racism in security operations, studied by administrators and activists alike. Bias training programs were now mandatory for airport security personnel nationwide. Body cameras had become standard equipment. Independent oversight boards were being established in major transportation hubs. The system was far from perfect, but it was better than it had been, and the momentum for change continued to build. Bradley Morrison had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for civil rights violations. The sentence was longer than his attorneys had hoped for and shorter than many activists had demanded, but it sent an important message about accountability. What surprised everyone was what happened during his incarceration. Bradley began reading, really reading, for perhaps the first time in his life. He devoured books about the history of racism in America, about the civil rights movement, about the experiences of Black Americans from slavery through the present day. He emerged from prison a changed man, or at least a man in the process of changing. One of his first actions upon release was to write a letter to Darnell Washington apologizing for everything he had done. The letter was long and detailed and demonstrated a genuine understanding of the harm he had caused. Bradley had begun volunteering for an organization that worked to combat racial prejudice, using his own story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked bias. Keith Patterson received a suspended sentence and 500 hours of community service. He fulfilled those hours at a youth center in an underserved community, working with young people who reminded him of the teenagers he had once viewed with automatic suspicion. The experience transformed him. He learned their names and their stories and their dreams. He began to see them as individuals rather than stereotypes. When his community service ended, he continued volunteering, eventually becoming a mentor to several young men who needed positive role models in their lives. Howard Morrison faced the harshest consequences. He was convicted on multiple felony counts including obstruction of justice and civil rights violations. His sentence of 3 years in federal prison was extended when additional evidence of his misconduct came to light during the trial. Unlike Bradley, Howard showed no signs of remorse or redemption. He maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings and blamed everyone but himself for his downfall. He died alone, 2 years into his sentence, of a heart attack that no one mourned. Tammy Sullivan had taken a different path. She became one of the most vocal advocates for security reform, speaking at conferences and training sessions about the importance of speaking up against injustice. Her testimony had been crucial in convicting Howard and in documenting the full extent of the discriminatory system he had created. She often said that her years of silence had been a kind of death, and that finding her voice had brought her back to life. She received hate mail from people who called her a traitor, but she also received letters of gratitude from people who had been victimized by the system she helped expose. Darnell continued his work at the FBI, but his role had expanded to include advocacy for civil rights and police reform. He testified before Congress about the need for comprehensive changes to law enforcement practices. He spoke at universities and community centers about his experience and about the broader struggle for equality. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contributions to justice and his courage in the face of discrimination. But the award that meant most to him was a simple thank you card from a young black man who had written to say that Darnell's story had given him hope that change was possible. Lorraine remained by his side through everything, her support unwavering and her love unconditional. She had started her own advocacy work, focusing on healthcare disparities that affected minority communities. Together, they had become a power couple for social justice, their partnership strengthening with every challenge they faced. Jasmine Washington was now 17 years old and had announced her intention to attend law school and specialize in civil rights litigation. She wanted to fight the way her father fought, with intelligence and dignity and an unshakable commitment to justice. The gold necklace with the heart pendant that had been unwrapped so rudely in that interrogation room still hung around her neck, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been gained. On the 1-year anniversary of his detention, Darnell returned to Charlotte Douglas International Airport. He walked through the same terminal where he had been humiliated, past the same waiting area where he had been approached by Bradley and his team. This time, he wore his FBI credentials proudly displayed on his chest. Security officers recognized him and nodded respectfully as he passed. The atmosphere was different now, lighter somehow, as if a shadow had been lifted from the building. He paused near gate B-17, the same gate where his nightmare had begun, and observed the travelers around him. There, sitting in a plastic chair with a phone pressed to his ear, was a young black man in a hoodie. He was laughing at something the person on the other end of the call had said, completely relaxed, completely unaware that he was being watched. A security officer walked by, glanced at the young man, smiled pleasantly, and continued on her way. No stopping. No questioning. No suspicion. Just a person being allowed to exist in peace. Darnell felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had been carrying for a year without fully realizing it. This was what he had fought for. Not revenge against those who had wronged him, but protection for those who came after. The battle was not over. Racism still existed, still infected systems and institutions and individual hearts. But this small victory, this one moment of normalcy for one young black man in one airport, it mattered. It all mattered. His phone buzzed with a text message from Jasmine. "Love you, Dad. See you at home." He smiled and typed his response. "Love you too, baby girl. I will be there soon." He pocketed the phone and walked toward his gate, and nobody stopped him. Nobody questioned him. He was just a man going home to his family. The plane lifted off into a clear blue sky, carrying Darnell away from the place where he had suffered and toward the people he loved. Below, Charlotte Douglas International Airport continued its endless rhythm of arrivals and departures. But something had changed in the air, in the way people looked at each other, in the hope that justice could prevail even when the odds seemed impossible. One man had made a difference. One voice had sparked a movement. One refusal to accept injustice had changed the world. The story does not end here. Stories like this never really end. They continue in every person who hears them and is moved to action. They continue in every policy that is changed and every mind that is opened. They continue in the quiet moments when someone chooses courage over silence, when someone decides to stand up rather than look away. And that brings me to you, the person watching this video right now. What role will you play in the ongoing story of justice and equality? Will you be a Bradley, letting prejudice guide your actions? Will you be a Tammy, watching injustice unfold and choosing not to intervene? Or will you be a Darnell, standing up for what is right even when it costs you dearly? I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me what you would have done in Darnell's situation. Would you have stayed calm like he did, or would you have reacted differently? What lessons do you take away from this story? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it inspired you to be better, please hit that like button and let me know. Your likes and engagement help this message reach more people who need to hear it. If you are not already subscribed to this channel, please subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. We are building a community of people who care about justice and equality and who believe that stories have the power to change the world. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Share it on your social media. Send it to a friend. The more people who hear Darnell's story, the more people who will be inspired to stand up against injustice in their own lives. Thank you for watching until the end. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for caring about these issues and for believing that change is possible. I wish you strength in the face of adversity, courage in the face of fear, and the wisdom to know that your voice matters. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. The world needs more people like Darnell Washington. The world needs more people like you. This powerful story teaches us several important lessons that we should carry with us throughout our lives. First, never judge a person by their appearance. Bradley Morrison looked at Darnell Washington and saw only a black man in a hoodie. He failed to see the dedicated FBI agent, the loving father, the man who had spent 23 years protecting his country. Assumptions based on skin color or clothing are dangerous and can lead to devastating consequences for innocent people. Second, silence makes you complicit. Tammy Sullivan watched discrimination happen repeatedly and chose not to speak up. Her silence enabled the abuse to continue. When we witness injustice and say nothing, we become part of the problem. Finding courage to speak up is essential for creating change. Third, true justice is about transformation, not revenge. Darnell had every opportunity to destroy the people who harmed him, but he chose reform over retribution. He understood that punishing individuals would not fix the broken system. Real change requires addressing root causes and building better institutions. Fourth, dignity in adversity reveals character. Despite hours of humiliation and mistreatment, Darnell maintained his composure. His calm response demonstrated strength far greater than anger could have shown. Finally, one person can make a difference. Darnell's decision to fight sparked a national movement that changed airport security practices across the country. Never underestimate the power of standing up for what is right. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination based on race or appearance? How did you respond, and what would you do differently today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because your stories matter and they help others feel less alone. If this story touched your heart and opened your eyes to the reality of racial profiling in America, please hit that like button right now. Your likes help this important message reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss powerful stories like this one. We share content that inspires, educates, and empowers our community every single week. Share this video with your friends, your family, and your social media followers. The more people who hear Darnell's story, the more awareness we create about the injustices that still exist in our society. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. Your support means everything to this channel. I wish you courage to stand against injustice wherever you find it, strength to maintain your dignity in difficult situations, and wisdom to judge people by their character rather than their appearance. Stay blessed, stay strong, and always remember that your voice has power. See you in the next video.